Barry Butters does. James Bond, A View to a Kill. Psst, I think there's something wrong with his eyes. Now, a lot of people regard this film as the worst Roger Moore Bond film overall, and some people even think it's one of the worst Bond films ever made. Now, I don't regard this as a great Bond film, but I don't think it's anywhere near as bad as a lot of people seem to think. It has its share of faults, to be sure, but it also has its fair share of positives. But most importantly, it's a very significant film in the evolution of Bond. It has the feel of a 1970s camp Bond with Roger Moore, but it also has some 1980s action vibes. I think it's actually like a bridge between the Moore and Dalton films. But I guess one of the first things we can say is that there's a sort of scaling back on the silliness of Octopussy. So the tone this time is a lot more balanced, I'd say. Now hold on a sec, I just got to give him a cup of coffee. There you go, sir. You do take milk, don't you? In general, A View to a Kill's got the same sort of light-hearted tone that we've gotten used to by this stage. You've got some of the camp silliness that's left over from the 1970s, but at the same time you've got a sense of the more meaner and grittier feel of a 1980s action movie. For one thing, Moore don't play up to the camera as much as he did in Octopussy. So there's only really one or two examples of this in the film. One occurs when he's playing the role of St. John Smythe, and then you've got another sort of similar occasion during the San Francisco chase sequence. But this film does follow Octopussy in having quite a lot of sexual innuendo.
Oh, my dear, I take it you spend quite a lot of time in the saddle.
Yes, I love an early morning ride.
Oh, I'm an early riser myself.
Here, put your hand on this. The wheel, take over.
Are you all right?
The bubbles tickle my Tchaikovsky.
There's also a fair amount of slapstick, but again probably not as much as Octopussy. This film also scales back on the comical use of music and sound effects, so there's only really one example of this in A View to a Kill. Another very silly element of the film is the presence of the robot dog.
Minister?
Commander.
Good morning, sir.
This actually reminds me quite a lot of the silly robot scene in Rocky IV, which came out in the same year.
Please make a wish.
It's creepy. That talks, that thing.
Creepy? These are great. I wish I had one of these when I was growing up. Come on, make a wish like he says.
I wish I wasn't in this nightmare.
Hey, very classy wish. Very nice. What do you think there? Very good, huh?
But I think this is all because there's quite a lot of interest in general in robots at this time. Mainly because of films like Saturn III, Blade Runner and The Terminator. So I guess the filmmakers thought they had to stick a robot in the film to make it seem more modern or something. This Bond film also stands out for making the French look completely ridiculous. Firstly, you got this French private detective called Aubergine, who's like a saucy French pervert.
Another excellent choice.
I'm pleased you approve, since you're paying the bill.
And then you've also got a French taxi driver, who has hysterics and complains about his car being stolen.
Oh my God! Oh!
But the English making fun of the French ain't nothing new, of course.
I am a musician and the monkey is a businessman. He doesn't tell me what to play and I don't tell him what to do with his money.
Monsieur, don't try to be funny with me. He is your monkey, therefore it is your money.
He lives with me, but he is not my monkey.
But the main reason why the film feels a lot more balanced this time around in terms of the tone is because it also contains quite a few nasty scenes. There's also at least one serious scene.
Killing Tibbet was a mistake.
I'm about to make the same mistake twice.
My department know I'm here. When I don't report, they'll retaliate.
If you're the best they have, they'll more likely try to cover up your embarrassing incompetence.
Don't count on it, Zoran.
In this film, Bond's also not a bastard again. He's still a bit of a softie. In fact, there's even a weird scene in the film where Bond makes this gorgeous blonde girl a quiche.
Et voila. Quiche. Steak happy name.
Sounds interesting. What is it?
An omelette.
Yes, so nothing says James Bond quite like making a quiche, does it? What were they thinking? Although I guess the thing is, he does make M a cup of coffee back in Live and Let Die.
Is that all it does?
So I suppose in this way, A View to a Kill provides a sort of closure, with Bond performing some domestic duties that seem completely out of character. Because after all, it's very hard to imagine Connery's Bond making a woman a quiche.
Dink, say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
I guess I should also say something about Moore's age at this point. Now, he obviously looks good for a bloke in his late 50s, but that don't necessarily mean that he's suitable for the role of James Bond, because lots of people at the time complained that he looked far too old for the role. But I suppose the thing is, nowadays we sort of got used to seeing older men in action roles. Now, Harrison Ford's an obvious example, and then you had Liam Neeson, and then you got Sylvester Stallone too. So after all that, seeing a bloke in his late 50s playing Bond don't seem as much of a big deal as it did back in the 1980s. But I have to agree though, on balance, he does look too old for the role, and he probably should have retired before this point. There's also a related point about cosmetic surgery. The thing is, at the time, Roger Moore had a mole removed because of concerns that it might become cancerous. But there's also at the same time speculation that he had a facelift. People have also mentioned that he might have had eye surgery, and in some of the scenes in the film there is something quite strange about his eyes. So his eyes only look strange at the beginning of the film. First of all when he talks to Moneypenny and M at the start, and then when he goes to Max Zorin's estate. But then later on in the film he looks more like his old self. So that's all a bit strange really. But it's not a big deal, I suppose. And as with the previous films, Roger Moore wears a fair number of suits this time. And also, this is the first time since On Her Majesty's Secret Service that James Bond wears a cravat. But in contrast to Octopussy, he don't wear quite so many disguises this time. In fact, I think there's only one disguise. And that's when Bond dresses up as one of Zorin's miners. But one similarity with Octopussy is that Bond wears both a black and a white DJ in this film. Yeah, so overall he wears quite a lot of different outfits this time. In this film we also see the return of the trusty Walter PPK, after its absence in the last film. Bond's also got quite a lot of gadgets this time, but probably not so many as he had in the last film. But in the opening sequence he's got this, well I think it's a metal detector. Then he's got these fancy sunglasses, those come in handy. Then he's got this ring that can take photos.
Selective breeding is important, yeah. But more important is conditioning and desire, yeah.
Are you talking about people or horses?
That comes in handy later on when he wants to know more about the people involved in Zorin's operation. Then Bond's also got this device where he can copy checks. But then Bond's also got this really weird gadget towards the end. It's a magnetic card that allows him to open sash windows. So I'd have to say the gadgets overall ain't that imaginative this time. Then in terms of the old Bond girls, we got this blonde girl at the start, and this is the pre-credit sequence.
Oh, Commander Bond.
Call me James. It's 5 days to Alaska.
And then we got Grace Jones as Mayday, and then we got this Russian girl.
The bubbles tickle my Tchaikovsky.
And then we got the main Bond girl, and that's Tanya Roberts playing the part of Stacey. Yeah, so the strange thing is we got 3 blonde girls this time that all look a bit similar. And then we got the rather magnificent Grace Jones, of course. And then we got Bond again as a similar good, and Zorro as a symbol of evil.
Better luck next time.
Not Zorro, I mean Zoran. And that's Christopher Walken, of course. And before we move on, I think it's worth saying a few more words about Zoran. So far I'd say we've had 3 different types of Bond villain. The first type is represented by Dr. No, and that's when you've got a cold and distant sort of character that's also a sort of mastermind. And then I'd say Stromberg is a second type, and that's your idealistic Bond villain, who wants to create a new type of world. But then the third type is Max Zorin, and that's when the villain becomes a complete psychopath. And this is a type of character that Christopher Walken is absolutely brilliant at portraying.
Every part is a challenge, and this is certainly different from anything I've ever done. It's exciting to be in a Bond movie.
At this stage in his career, Christopher Walken is already an Academy Award winner. He won Best Supporting Actor for The Deer Hunter, of course.
Thank you, Michael. I'm very happy to have this. I salute Michael Cimino.
So The Deer Hunter made Walken's name. But the thing is, he actually played quite a different sort of character in this film. He played the part of a sensitive young man who's traumatised by his experiences in the Vietnam War. So The Deer Hunter is a very serious film, and it delves into the themes of mental illness and post-traumatic stress disorder.
I like the trees, you know? I like the way the trees are in the mountains, all different. The way the trees are.
Mao! Put an empty chamber in that gun. Mao! 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 God damn it!
Just come home. Home. Talk to me. Please talk to me.
But since then, Walken has been pretty typecast as a villain or a psychopath, which is then cemented in A View to a Kill, where he plays the world's first psychopathic Bond villain. The thing about Walken is that he's got a very unpredictable variation when it comes to the delivery of lines. The main thing is that he varies the volume of his voice unexpectedly. So he'll be speaking at a normal volume and seem very calm at times. Then he'll suddenly erupt into anger, impatience and defiance.
Come to the point, General.
You disregard procedure. You did not request approval before eliminating 007. Reprisals might jeopardize ongoing operations.
You jeopardize mine! You jeopardize mine! You jeopardize mine!
But then he might throw in an unexpected whisper.
I have a stallion. Descended from that horse there. Misty. Misty. Misty.
His voice also occasionally becomes all gravelly and deep.
What have they done? You discharged her. So she and her accomplice came here to kill you. Then they set fire to the office to conceal the crime. But they were trapped in the elevator. But they were trapped in the elevator. But they were trapped in the elevator.
He also has long pauses mid-sentence that don't make any sense.
This is the heartland of electronic production in the United States, which accounts for what, 80% of the world microchip market. I propose to end I propose to end the domination of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so for me, Christopher Walken's portrayal of Zoran is the absolute highlight of the movie. The thing about Walken is that he's able to portray a character that seems to take a positive delight in being evil, which is something we ain't really seen before. I don't actually know if I've seen another film where the villain enjoys being evil this much, except maybe the Emperor in Star Wars. According to this book, this is something that Roger Moore complained about. He basically thought that this type of cruelty didn't really belong in a James Bond film. But I have to say, I don't think that's quite accurate. Because I think the thing is, this is just something we hadn't seen in the film version of Bond before. But the portrayal of cruelty had been a feature of the Fleming vision from the very start. Just think of the torture scene in Casino Royale. And this is all directly taken from Fleming's first novel. And apparently cinema audiences weren't ready for this until 2006. In fact, this sort of thing was something that critics of the books always complained about. At the time, people said this about the novel The Doctor No, which they said was too cruel and sadistic. And a lot of the cruelty in the Doctor No novel doesn't make its way into the 1962 film. So I have to say, I think Moore's completely wrong about this point. It was just something that was very at odds with his family-friendly portrait of Bond, which at the end of the day never really had very much to do with the original Fleming vision of Bond. Finally, I think I should also mention the death scene, because I think this is the only time in a Bond film, and also in any other film that I've seen, where the villain takes a positive delight in facing death itself. And I have to say, I absolutely love this scene, because you see this change on his face. At first, Zoran experiences a moment of terror when he realises that he's about to die, but then somehow his sense of humour is even stronger than his fear of death, and he just bursts out laughing. And for me, this is such a brilliant portrayal of complete insanity, and it's an absolute delight to watch. Now moving on, I think we can say a few interesting things about the supporting characters this time. Because this is Lois Maxwell's last appearance as Moneypenny, and she ain't got Penelope Smallbone with her this time.
I've been trying to reach you all morning. What have you been up to?
Rest and recreation, my darling. Well, the trip back from Siberia took a lot out of me.
Your dedication when you're on the job is most commendable, James.
Then we got a combined scene with M and Q.
Now, if I place it on the microcomparator and compare it with a chip that Commander Bond recovered from the body of 003 in Siberia...
But this film then does something quite unusual, because we immediately cut to another scene with the same three main supporting characters in a completely different scene. And this is when we see all of them at the races, at Ascot.
That's Pegasus, Zoran's horse.
With the cane, is that Max Zorin?
Yes. Born in Dresden, fled from East Germany in the 60s. French passport, speaks at least 5 languages, no accent.
And then about 20 minutes in, we get another scene with M. And this is a sort of similar scene to the one we saw in Octopussy.
What did you learn from Aubergine before his untimely demise?
Well, only that Zorin is having a thoroughbred sale at his stud not far from here.
In addition to all that, we also get some closing scenes with the main supporting characters. We see M talking to Gogol, and we see Moneypenny crying over the fact that James Bond has gone missing. And then we see Q finding Bond with the help of his robot dog. Yeah, but as I was saying, this is the last appearance of Lois Maxwell, and she's been with us for the first 14 films, and that's from 1962 to 1985. So in addition to Sean Connery as Bond and Bernard Lee as M, and Desmond Llewellyn as Q, Lois Maxwell as Moneypenny was a distinctive feature of what gave the early Bond films their unique sense of flavour. So we salute you, Lois Maxwell, and thank you for all your years of valuable service. But we still don't get Felix Leiter this time, so that's now the 6th absence in a row. But this time we get 2 Felix Leiter replacements. The first is Patrick McNee, who's playing the part of Sir Godfrey Tippett, and this actor was already famous for playing a secret agent of his own called John Steed in the television series The Avengers. He also happened to know Roger Moore.
Barbara Broccoli had suggested me to her father, Cubby Broccoli, for the part of the jockey.
He was a friend of Barbara's.
And he said, well, isn't he a bit big for a jockey? She said, well, couldn't you change it? And so they made it a racehorse trainer.
There's an interesting chemistry between Roger Moore and Patrick McNee.
We, of course, were worked on next stages to one another all through the years when I was doing the Satan, then he was doing the Avengers. Well done, my good man.
Do we have to keep this up when we're alone?
Well, successful cover becomes almost second nature.
But unfortunately he comes to a bit of a sticky end when Mayday kills him in a car wash. But Bond then gets a second Felix Leiter replacement once he arrives in San Francisco, and that's the CIA agent Chuck Lee. And I always found this strange that they didn't use Felix Leiter for this role. That don't really make a lot of sense to me.
Chuck Lee, CIA. It's a pleasure working with 007.
Thanks. Now what about Zard?
And this is the actor called David Yip, who was another actor that was well known to the British public at the time, because he starred in this TV programme called The Chinese Detective, and that ran from 1981 to 1982.
A new series of The Chinese Detective starts soon on BBC One.
Oh, I'm very busy. It's your case, you deal with it. Vamos.
But he was also known to audiences internationally because he appeared in the second Indiana Jones film, The Temple of Doom.
Don't worry, Wuhan, I'll get you out of here.
Not this time, Indy. I followed you on many adventures. Into the great unknown mystery. I go first, Indy.
I was terrified, you know, to meet Roger Moore, and he was sweet. He was a sweetheart.
The biggest problem I realised was crowds. I mean, you got onto Fisherman's Wharf and they set all this up, but there were literally thousands of people wanting to see the filming.
In terms of the set pieces, we've got a lot of variation in the chases this time. Because we got a ski chase where Bond also uses a snow buggy, and then he also improvises and creates a snowboard. But at this point we've seen a lot of ski chases with Roger Moore. We had one in The Spy Who Loved Me, and then we had another one in For Your Eyes Only, and then we got this one. The thing is, a lot of people associate James Bond with ski chases, but it's mainly the Roger Moore Bonds. And in addition to that, we've also got an horse chase. Although this ain't the first time we've seen Moore's Bond on horseback. We saw him riding an horse in Moonraker, and also in Octopussy. And then we got another variation on a car chase, which is a car chase that's chasing a parachute. And then we got another car chase in the form of a fire truck sequence in San Francisco. And then you got your trusty old fist fights again. We also see quite an unusual variation with the gunfights this time. First of all, we get the PPK versus a fishing rod. And then we see Bond using a shotgun. And after Moonraker, this is the second time. We also get quite a nice little daring escape in this film, where Bond escapes from a car underwater. This film also has quite a few explosions, and it has quite an interesting variation on the old exploding enemy base that we see in lots of James Bond films. In this way, it's sort of similar to the other variations that we've seen over the course of the film. They're definitely trying to keep things fresh by changing things up slightly. So instead of an exploding enemy base, we get this.
Stacy, hold tight! Keep her down!
And of course, like all the other Roger Moore Bond films, we get more than our fair share of sex scenes.
I just can't believe it.
Well, life is short. I mean, f*** him. You know, who needs it? Come on, get ready.
So in this Bond film, the pre-credit sequence is actually part of the main story, and this is where we see James Bond recovering a microchip in Siberia from the dead body of 003. After the credit sequence, we then see Bond in London with M, Q and the Minister of Defence, and Q's able to analyse the microchip that Bond retrieved in Siberia, and Q figures out that it's a very distinctive type of microchip. It's got special technology in it that makes it impervious to EMP, and that's electromagnetic pulse. And they also figure out at the same time that it's made by Zorin Industries. This is actually technology that the British had been developing in secret. But this particular chip is a copy of that technology that's been made by Zorin Industries. So quite naturally that makes them all rather suspicious of Max Zorin. And this is when they all then decide to head over to Ascot to observe the owner. And during the horse race they see that Zorin's horse Pegasus wins the race. And after the race, this bloke called Sir Godfrey Tibbett tells Bond that he thinks the horses are being drugged. Tibbett also puts Bond in contact with this French detective called Aubergine. And old Aubergine comes in handy because he tells Bond that Zorin is holding an horse sale later on in the same month at his estate. But during their meeting, Aubergine is assassinated. He's actually killed by Zorin's bodyguard, Mayday. We then get a rather fantastic chase sequence, but Mayday is actually able to escape from Bond. When Bond arrives at Zorin's estate, he pretends to be this bloke called James St. John Smythe. And you can't really forget this name because Bond says it about 500 times.
Mr. St. John Smith?
St. John Smythe, my dear. St. John Smythe.
By the way, the name is St. John Smythe. By the way, the name is James St. John Smythe.
But basically Bond is just pretending to be a rich bloke who's inherited a lot of money from his auntie. But while he's in disguise, Bond is also able to do a fair amount of snooping. And he finds out that Zorin has just made out a cheque to this beautiful blonde girl, but he's not able to figure out why. But in the night time, under cover of darkness, Bond and Tibbett investigate Zorin's estate, and they find his secret laboratory. And Bond is able to figure out that Zorin has been injecting his horses with adrenaline, and the shots are administered by using microchip technology. But unfortunately Max Zorin is pretty smart, and he's able to figure out Bond's true identity. After that he has Mayday assassinate Tibbett, and he also attempts to kill Bond. But Bond is able to escape, and he lives to fight another day, after he sucks some air out the tyres of a Rolls Royce. After all this happens, we get a brief scene between Zorin and Gogol. And we find out that Zorin has been trained by the KGB, but he's sort of gone rogue and started doing things that he's not supposed to. In this way his character's a bit similar to General Orlov from Octopussy. The story then goes off in a slightly different direction, where we get a boardroom scene with Zorin talking to a group of investors, and he tells them his master plan. He plans to destroy Silicon Valley. And after this happens, Zorin will have a complete monopoly over the manufacture of microchips. In this section of the film, I think we can see the influence of both Goldfinger and Thunderball. Zorin's plan to control the manufacture of microchips by destroying Silicon Valley is very similar to Goldfinger's attempt to radiate the gold in Fort Knox in order to control the gold supply. You can also see the influence of Goldfinger with this map scene that comes out of the table, which is very similar to the mechanical device in the rumpus room of Goldfinger. And just like Goldfinger, Zorin's got a secret name for his operation. He calls it Project Main Strike, which is very similar to Goldfinger's Grand Slam. But the influence of Thunderball is more obvious, insofar as you've got a boardroom meeting that involves an execution. At this point in the story, we also get a change of location, because Bond travels to San Francisco where he meets the CIA agent Chuck Lee. Chuck Lee tells Bond that Zorin is the product of medical experimentation carried out by a Nazi scientist. The story then goes off on another tangent when Bond investigates one of Zorin's oil rigs. But while he's there, he comes across some KGB agents, and they're trying to sabotage Zorin's operation. Pola Avanova is recording Zorin's conversation while her partner is placing explosives. But unfortunately, Ivanova's partner is killed when he's caught by Zorin. But Ivanova and Bond manage to escape. And then they have a little bit of sexy time in an hot tub. But when things are about to get interesting, Ivanova steals the recording. But what she don't know is that Bond switched the tapes when she weren't looking. So he's the one that's got the recording, and he's able to glean some interesting information. At this point, Bond tracks down Stacey Sutton, and she's the blonde girl from earlier who we saw at Zorin's estate, where he wrote her a cheque for $5 million. When Bond meets up with Stacey, he figures out that this payment was actually for her family oil business. The two of them then decide to go to the City Hall in San Francisco to see if they can find Zorin's submitted plans. But unfortunately, Zorin's already onto them. He kills the chief geologist and then he sets fire to the building in order to frame Bond for the murder. After all that, Bond and Stacey escape in a fire engine. Then the following day, they decide to infiltrate Zorin's mine. Once they're inside, Bond and Stacey figure out that Zorin has placed explosives along the Hayward and San Andreas faults. And because Stacey is an expert in geology, she's able to figure out that this will cause the flooding of Silicon Valley. Zorin has also placed a larger bomb to destroy the geological lock that would prevent the two faults from moving at the same time. With everything set up and unaware of the presence of Bond, Zorin then sets his plan in motion. He floods the mine and kills his own workers, and with a big smile on his mischievous little face. After flooding the mine, Zorin escapes in his airship. Luckily, Stacey is able to escape before the mine floods, but Bond is left behind to fight Mayday. But then Mayday switches sides when she figures out that Zorin betrayed her. He left her to drown along with all his other workers. And Mayday then helps Bond to scupper Zorin's plans. She helps him remove the larger bomb from the mine. But when they put the explosive device on an handcar, it gets stuck on the rail. And this is when Mayday decides to sacrifice her own life. And she rides the handcar out of the mine herself, and it explodes and she dies. After Zorin sees the explosion, he kidnaps Stacey. But at the same time, Bond is also able to grab hold of the mooring rope. As the airship is approaching Golden Gate Bridge, Zorin tries to knock Bond off. But he's able to hang on, and then Bond is able to moor the airship to the framework of the bridge. The airship then explodes and Bond has saved the day yet again. We then get a couple of closing scenes. We get one scene back in London, and this is when Gogol awards Bond the Order of Lenin for scuppering the plans of a rogue KGB agent. The film then ends with Q discovering the location of Bond. So he basically watches Bond and Stacy shagging in the shower with the aid of his robot dog. And this is a scene that brings the Roger Moore era to a close. Before we move on, I just want to point out that I think there's something slightly weird about the plot this time. Now, it's not that it don't make sense exactly, but I think the problem is that you got so many different plot points this time, and the various plot points don't really connect with each other. Because I never really understood the point of establishing the idea that comes in at the start. And that's the idea of Zoran developing these new type of chips that are resistant to EMP shocks. And once this idea is established at the start, no one ever mentions it again. And I think there's a very obvious way in which they could have made use of this idea. So I think it would have made a lot more sense if they got rid of the earthquake idea. And the idea, of course, of flooding Silicon Valley. So I think what they should have done is have a finale where Zoran sends out an EMP blast from outer space, which destroys all the microchips on Earth except his own stockpile of EMP resistant chips. He'd then be able to supply the rest of the world with his own stockpile, and he'd make a fortune. I guess they might not have gone with this sort of idea because it would have been very similar to Diamonds Are Forever. And they might have wanted to avoid going into space again, like they did a few films ago with Moonraker. The other thing is that it's never really spelled out why Zoran wants to flood Silicon Valley in the first place. It does kind of make sense and you can work this out from watching the film itself, but there's no equivalent scene to the one in Goldfinger, where the villain explains his plans to Bond.
Well, if you exploded in Fort Knox, the entire gold supply of the United States will be radioactive for 57 years. 58 to be exact.
I'd also say that the old plot line about the horses at the start seems completely unnecessary. It does of course connect with the theme of developing microchips, but it seems very tangential to me. But there you go, just one or two complaints about the story this time. It don't quite gel together as well as most of the other Bond films. Here you are, my dear. I know how much you like quiche.
Bond is investigating him, and we're both, have a reason to be after him. And it's really integral to moving the plot ahead and really makes the movie go. In other words, it wouldn't work. The story wouldn't work without Stacy. So it's not just a pretty girl on his arm at all.
Now, there is a Bond girl in the short story, but Stacy bears no resemblance to her whatsoever. So there's not really much point in me going into detail about this character. And she's a very minor character anyway. I'd say Tanya Roberts is pretty good in this film. She's not anything exceptional, but then I don't think she's as bad as lots of fans think she is. I think the main problem with the character of Stacy is that she's somehow not very believable as a geologist. Now, I don't know why that is exactly. Maybe it's just because she's too beautiful and glamorous. I think it might have helped if they'd made her a bit more nerdy. But the problem is she's always wearing lots of makeup and these expensive looking dresses, which is a more fitting attire for a damsel in distress, rather than a scientist. Now, I can think of an example where an actress plays a very convincing geologist, and that's the girl from Tremors.
Well, I'm supposed to monitor these seismographs. Well, they measure vibrations.
Vibrations in the ground.
Yeah.
She's obviously a pretty girl, but she's not wearing a lot of makeup and she's also wearing very normal clothes. And I think this helps with the believability. Now, I'm not saying a beautiful blonde girl couldn't be a geologist in real life, but this is the movies where things have to be very signposted or even stereotyped. So when you've got a scientist in a movie, they have to look like a scientist by looking like a nerd, basically. I think the problem is that the audience of a Bond film are always expecting a very glamorous girl. and if they didn't get one, they'd be kind of disappointed. So you need a girl who's very beautiful and very elegant, and Stacey does provide that. But because she provides this, she's also not a very convincing geologist, which is what the character demands. So these two things are sort of in conflict, which I think of as the source of the problem.
You will have long blonde hair, big green eyes, world-class breasts, ass that won't quit, and legs that go all the way up.
And then of course we got Mayday, and I have to say I think Grace Jones does a brilliant job in this film.
I remember when I first did the makeup and I thought, oh, maybe he might think it's too strong or something like that. The director, John Glenn. And it was great because he came and he says, oh, put more red down there and more color. I went, oh, wonderful. I couldn't believe it.
She tends to wear these outfits that have very bold colours and strong lines, and this exaggerates the sort of strong and menacing presence of her character. But the character arc of Mayday is actually quite similar to the character of Jaws, insofar as she's a villain who experiences a sort of crisis of conscience and then changes sides.
And I thought that creep loved me.
You're not the only one he double-crossed.
Get on the rig. I'll lower you down.
And I have to say I don't particularly like this feature of the film. I didn't like it in Moonrake, and I don't really like it in A View to a Kill.
I am completely not the person I'm playing. I mean, I'm a villain sometimes, but on a much, much smaller scale.
And then of course you got Fiona Fullerton playing the part of a Russian spy. And I have to say I think this is completely awful.
Are you all right?
The bubbles tickle my Tchaikovsky.
Again, it sort of reminds me of a performance of a porn actress, and it's absolutely terrible. So I think this scene is all rather embarrassing, and I think the film would be better off if Fiona Fullerton weren't in it at all. I think the only other thing that's worth mentioning about this topic is that Maud Adams is rumoured to have a cameo in this film.
I went up to visit Roger and Louisa just for dinner and say hello in San Francisco. And they were shooting at Fisherman's Wharf. And I am said to be in the background somewhere. So I've actually made 3 James Bond movies.
She said, oh, just for a bit of fun, I'll just walk in the background like an extra. She did.
I mean, that's the great big mystery. Can you find me in A View to a Kill? Please let me know when and where.
Well, can I interest you in another slice?
Of course, Ian Fleming is the originator of the character, but his stories are very much out of date now. So what we do is we use the titles, but we write a completely new story.
In comparison to the previous reviews, I'd say there's not so much to say about the adaptation issue this time, because A View to a Kill is a completely original screenplay that's not really based on the short story at all. In this way, it's sort of comparable to The Spy Who Loved Me, because that film really didn't have much to do with the Fleming source material either, aside from the fact that the title came from Ian Fleming. Now, the short story A View to a Kill is on a completely different subject. The short story begins with a dispatch rider riding through France towards Saint-Germain, and this bloke is then assassinated by another bloke on a motorcycle. And this bloke then steals the dispatch case from the dead man, and this contains important intel. It's then up to Bond to recover the intel and figure out who carried out the assassination. And this being a short story, of course, he does all that fairly quickly. And that's all there is to the short story, really. But nevertheless, there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning. First of all, this short story recounts how Bond lost his virginity at the age of 16 in Paris. Yeah, so take a look at this. If he had wanted a solid drink, he had had it at Harry's bar. Both because of the solidity of the drinks and because, on his first ignorant visit to Paris at the age of 16, he had done what Harry's advertisement in the Continental Daily Mail had told him to do and had said to his taxi driver, Sank Row Do New. That had started one of the memorable evenings of his life, culminating in the loss, almost simultaneous, of his virginity and his note case. So when the short story starts, Bond is already in Paris after a failed assignment. After the murder of the dispatch rider, Bond is taken to the Paris HQ of the Secret Service by a girl who tells Bond that it's an emergency. The head of F Station then tells Bond about the assassination. Yeah, so it goes, head of F said, somebody got our Dawn dispatch rider from Shape to the St Germain station yesterday morning. The weekly run from Shape Intelligence Division with the summaries, joint intelligence papers, Iron Curtain order of battle, all the top gen. I think there's also something worth explaining about the title itself, A View to a Kill. Because in the context of the short story, From a View to a Kill makes perfect sense. Because Bond is presented with a natural scene, which are the natural surroundings of the killer's lair. So this is the view that he sees as he lies in wait before making the kill. And this is before he kills the bloke who stole the intel at the start. So in the context of the short story, Bond literally goes from a view to a kill. And this occurs when Bond sees three men emerge from a secret wooded lair. Yeah, so have a look at this. It was like the opening of a hinged Easter egg. In a moment, the two segments stood apart, and the two halves of the rosebush, still alive with bees, were splayed widely open. Now the inside of the metal casing that supported the earth and the roots of the bush were naked to the sun. There was a glint of pale electric light from the dark aperture between the curved doors. The whine of the motor had stopped. A head and shoulders appeared, and then the rest of the man. I think it's also a minor point of interest that the film itself was also originally going to be titled From a View to a Kill, and you can see that in the closing credits of Octopussy. But for some reason they decided to drop the word from the title. So the film became A View to a Kill. And this title has a completely different meaning in the context of the film. And that's revealed in this scene between Mayday and Zoran.
Wow. What a view to a kill.
So in the context of the film, a view means San Francisco, or Silicon Valley, and a kill refers to Zoran's plan to flood Silicon Valley. Yeah, so there you go, that's all quite interesting. So we've arrived at the end of another era, and that's the Roger Moore era, of course.
My name is Bond. James.
Yeah, so like I was saying at the start, some critics regard this film as one of the worst Bond movies ever made. I don't think it's great, but I also don't think it's as bad as all that. I think the film's main fault is its plot, which is a little weak at times. The individual plot points make sense, but they don't gel together quite so well as the previous Bonds. I think it suffers from the same sort of problem as Octopussy, and that's the fact that you've almost run out of original source material at this point. The thing is, Ian Fleming was very good at writing stories, and these stories provided a very firm foundation for the early Bond films. And without this crutch, I think we see the film struggling slightly. And I've got to say, I think the Bond girl is a bit of a weakness in this film too. She's not absolutely terrible, it's just that she's not a very convincing geologist. The other issue, of course, is that Roger Moore looks too old at this point. And while I agree with this point, it don't really bother me quite so much. And I think that's partly because we now got used to seeing older men in action roles. And as I've also said over the course of this review, I think Christopher Walken's Zoran is one of the highlights of the film. It feels like a bit more of a modern portrayal of a more realistic villain, who's a bit more psychologically believable than the previous Bond villains, and he's a complete psychopath. One surprising thing about A View to a Kill that they couldn't possibly have known at the time is that the film actually ages very well, insofar as it's all about microchips and their importance to the global economy. In this way it's kind of comparable to The Man with the Golden Gun, with its focus on the decline in oil industry and the energy crisis, and the invention of a new type of solar technology. But in summary, I'd say that although this film has its share of faults, it's still very enjoyable and a fun film to watch.
Absolutely useless.
No, don't be so hard on yourself. It's not all bad. Yeah, so I think you can see very clearly now what my impression is of Roger Moore's Bond. Basically, I think of the first 3 films as the strongest. Then a definite decline sets in with Moonraker. And I associate this decline with the introduction of too much comedy. And that's mainly under the direction of Lewis Gilbert. We first see this approach in The Spy Who Loved Me, but in that film it's still sort of under control. But by the time we get to Moonraker, things get a bit out of hand. And then when John Glenn takes over, I think he basically maintains this approach that was formulated by Lewis Gilbert. But then again, not completely. In general, his films are a little grittier, which you got an early indication of in For Your Eyes Only. But anyway, it's on to Pastures New, and Timothy Dalton next. And with Timothy Dalton, we're about to get another reinvention of Bond. Just like Roger Moore offered us a reinvention of the character with Live and Let Die. But most fans regard Dalton as the most faithful to the Fleming Bond. And as a big fan of the novels myself, I have to agree. So I'm looking forward to the 2 Dalton films. It will make a nice change of pace after spending so much time talking about Roger Moore. But I'm also going to miss Roger Moore. Even though I don't rate his later films that highly, I have a real fondness for Roger Moore himself. But there you go, that's the end of an era. So all that it remains for me to say is that there's 14 down and 11 to go. This is Barry Butters signing out, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, James. Mm. Mm. Mm.